Now let's talk about business and property. The recent assessment done by the Financial Intelligence Center shows how the real estate sector is at risk of involvement in money laundering. This through criminals creeping into property transactions. The group says there's an urgency for real estate agents to look into anti-money laundering measures to mitigate the risks. For more on this discussion, let's bring in property law specialist Cilna Steyn. She's also managing director for law firm SSLR Incorporated. We also have Anthony Ketcher, a regional manager for Seeff Property Group, and Erwin. He's a property economist and CEO of Röder and Associates. Let me start with you, Mr. Ketcher. I'm just interested to know, as Seeff, have you fallen victim to such crimes before, and how many?
Fortunately, it's not something that we've had too many incidents with, but I must say that going back over the last probably 7 or 8 years now, we've been working very closely. We're registered as an accountable institution with the Financial Intelligence Center, and we've had as all the real estate companies have had, is a know your customer program where, we've had to look critically at our customers, who we're dealing with, where the fund's coming on. It's just that at the moment, it would appear that there's a lot more focus being put on this, probably as a result of the Financial Action Task Force that has been recommending, the intergovernmental group that has been recommending that we need to put even more focus on the process. But I can't say, there have been incidents, there's no doubt, and but I think we have got a fairly good working relationship with the Financial Intelligence Center in terms of the way they've put in procedures for us.
And normally, if this happens by law, what can you do? Is it a long process, or do you find the the criminals quickly? And what kind of punishment would normally happen?
Look, it's probably a little bit outside of our ambit. What we do is we report matters to the Financial Intelligence Center, and those things are then picked up by the various agencies and dealt with by the agencies. We do not get all that involved. As long as we are doing our compliance now, we are doing the things correctly in terms of making sure that we uncover these people. It's then left up to other agencies to deal with the matters.
Okay, let me bring in Cilna Steyn now. She's, of course, director of the law firm SSLR Incorporated. Cilna, just explain to me how this would ordinarily happen, because obviously as a buyer, you usually would view the house, you give the seller your offer, they accept it, then the bank comes in, and also you pay lawyers for transfer duty. It's quite a large amount of money that happens during that whole process. But in terms of money laundering, how exactly would that happen in the property sector?
Sure. I wish there was only one answer for this. The truth about people being naughty when it comes to money, I think the list of potential crimes that can be committed is about as long as my arm. And I think that is exactly the problem. And I think this is what property practitioners should be aware of. Because you have a trust account, and I suppose that's very similar for us as attorneys, because you have a trust account, it's a very, let's say, easy way of cleaning money. If you pay money into a trust account, the moment it comes out of the trust account, it is considered to be safe and already been through the process required by FICA. And so what would typically happen is either a completely fraudulent transaction, a seller that is in fact not the owner of the property, that's selling a property by true fraud. And those transactions luckily can be set aside, but once again, you have to go through a long legal process to achieve that. But we also see a lot of fraud, especially in the context of rentals, where a landlord, not a true landlord, will inform the tenant of a change of banking details, and in doing so, effectively stealing money. And I mean, that's not even just in contravention of FIC, that is theft. Or you will have a situation where a trust account is misused by funds being paid into an estate agent's trust account under the guise of something or the other mistake, and they ask that you refund that money. And I think that is where a lot of agents very often fall prey to this, because they think it was a bona fide error, and then they don't follow the full FICA process when it comes to money accidentally, not really accidentally, being paid into your trust account and then refunding it from your trust account, now nicely clean after a trust account. So I think the answer for estate agents is be super careful with all funds in your trust account, whether it was accidentally or intentionally, and know your customer, as Anthony rightly said.
Cilna, I want to come back to you. I think I see how it would happen in, a scenario of somebody renting out a property and paying the owner of the property or the landlord directly, right? I understand how it would happen in that scenario. But in a scenario where it's a buyer-seller, where there's so many, institutions such as banks and law firms, etc., that are involved there, then there must be an inside job from one of these institutions then for such a crime to happen. Am I correct?
Yes, I wouldn't necessarily say inside job, but what I would say is fraud. We do see a lot of fraud, especially in the sales context, where somebody would position themselves to make the other party believe they, for instance, the executor of a deceased estate, selling a property then from a deceased estate where you do not actually have the right to do so. So once it's a normal sales transaction between a seller and a purchaser, there's an estate agent involved, there was necessary deed searches done, and the process runs through the bank, through the deeds office. The chances of that being a dangerous transaction is less. It's more the risk of fraud than anything else. And this is exactly why I think it's this difficult for us to wrap our minds around a transaction where this would happen, because it's not a normal transaction, it is a fraudulent transaction.
Exactly. Let me come to Mr. Roeder. He's a property economist. So you've heard that there's been a report that suggests that the property industry is at high risk of money laundering and such cases. Just explain to me, as a property economist, how big of a risk this is, and how much would people get away with? I mean, there's some houses that are, for instance, 8 million rand, 20 million rand. How huge is this type of crime in the property industry?
Well, of course, I can't tell you how huge that type of crime is. That's completely out of my ambit. But what I can say is that one of the biggest risks that estate agents run is that they get this offer of a very big deal and suspecting that the money may not be kosher, but nevertheless go through with it and don't report it. You won't believe me, but about 3 years ago, I was in one of our neighboring countries, and I was addressing a meeting of estate agents there, and they started complaining to me about those new regulations that they now have to report good deals, squashing their own good deals by being honest and reporting suspicious transactions.
Now, part of your job is also, for instance, to evaluate and structure the finance of property, etc. So during that time, do you find yourself, as well as a property economist, realizing, have you ever seen this happen basically while doing your job, and you realize, okay, there's a red flag with this particular client or this particular developer, etc.? Have you seen that in any of the cases that you've dealt with?
Not at all, but you're asking the wrong person. You see, I'm a higher level up. I don't do with I don't work with the nitty-gritty. I'm a researcher, so I do high-level research and high-level and valuations, of course. Those are the two main, and consultants who work in general. So I wouldn't know about the nitty-gritty of, or have a feeling for how how much of it is happening around us. But certainly, as we all know, the world over, we are trying to clamp down on it. I say we, I'm not part of it. And there's a good reason, of course, because theft or misallocation of capital is not good for the economy, as we all do know, very well know in this country too.
All right, let me come back to Cilna. I don't know if your law firm has ever dealt with, realizing or, one of the agents coming to you to say there's a red flag with this particular case, etc. Do you ever deal with something like that?
I must say, luckily we do, because by the time, if it comes to us at that stage, we can do something about it. We specifically specialize in rentals and evictions, so I am much more part of the rental side of the industry, but also in sales. We do see a lot of fraudulent activity as the conveyancers as well, where you will receive new banking details to, for instance, pay the proceeds to. So there was a seller and a purchaser, there's money that has to be paid over to the seller. And in the meantime, but that's not the typical fraud that we're talking about now. This is typically internet fraud, where you receive an email of changed banking details. And I know, sadly, of quite a few conveyancing attorneys that fell prey to that and pay the money out to the incorrect banking details. I think that's a very classic problem. Luckily, the Legal Practice Council is very aware of this, and as attorneys, we are very aware of banking details that gets changed. But in a rental context, there is actually quite a few cases that I've seen where a tenant would pay a massive amount in cash, for instance, a full year ahead in rental payments in cash. Luckily, we get the question, is this fine? And we will typically do due diligence, assist the agency to make sure we know exactly where the funds come from, and obviously do the necessary, well, advise them to do the necessary reporting to FIC. So I have seen quite a few of these cases, and there were sadly quite a few of these cases that does not check out properly. And then my advice would always be never ever touch funds unless you know exactly where it's coming from, because to try and deal with it once it's in your account is a bit of a problem if you had the opportunity to stop it or report it before it actually landed in your account.
Let me come back to Mr. Ketcher. You said that there have been some incidents where you've had to report it in terms of people, performing such crimes in that particular industry. I don't know if you'll be able to tell me at all usually who the culprits are. Is it the seller? Is it the buyer? Is it mostly the landlord in a renting type of scenario? I'm just trying to get to, and of course I'll ask Mr. Rhoda as well, in terms of maybe if he has advice for all these people involved when you come to property. But in your experience, who usually is the culprit?
Dominantly the buyer, because they have cash that they want to launder and clear through the system. And in fact, just a point on that, we often pick up resistance from clients when we ask for information. And, I think there's this perception that we're invading their privacy. When we ask for specific information, we need to make sure that we have established whether the transaction is good. I'm not saying it doesn't happen with sellers. It could be a case of the seller has already bought a house and they've already done some laundering. Now they're selling again, or they put a property into the name of a child or a juristic person, a company. But I would say the majority of the cases are buyers.
Mr. Rhoda, I don't know if you'd be able to, for instance, just assist the viewers whether a person is a buyer or a seller. We've heard information, for instance, or advice given to agents themselves when dealing with property. But I don't know if you'd be able to give advice to those viewers rather, who might be the buyer or the seller or somebody looking to rent.
I think you must use your common sense and your intuition to start off with, of course. I mean, if you have a big deal of, say, R100 million house being bought by somebody from the UAE, say, a red flag automatically could go up. Even more so if it's from north of the Limpopo River. And of course within South Africa as well, if I were to pick up $100 million note in the street, how the hell do I get rid of it? I got to walk into a bank and say, please deposit it for me, because of what we've just heard, of course. So it's a very difficult thing to get rid of stolen money. And yes, property is probably one of the sitters. It's one of the natural alternatives that had been used and is being used.
Let me end with you, Cilna, in terms of the fact that money exchanges hands when it comes to this, etc. This is also a very easy way for some people to avoid paying tax, right? I mean, you pay something in cash. The seller is very excited to receive that cash, sometimes even in foreign currency. And what do the tax laws say in terms of foreign currency? Like Mr. Roeder was saying, somebody from the UAE wanting to give you money for a 100 million rand house. What does the tax law say in terms of how much of foreign currency a person can actually take in cash and how much they're supposed to actually declare with SARS?
Well, now I'll be honest and say you're asking the eviction lawyer tax advice, so I'm going to avoid detail on numbers there, but at least I can say when I don't know something. What I can say is the process of transfer of a property requires a tax clearance certificate. And obviously, so your threshold for transfer duty is R1 million, but you need a tax clearance certificate to transfer property for this specific reason. So the only way you're going to get a property transferred into your name where the funds are not clean money, if it's stolen money, and it would be difficult, and you're going to have somebody at SARS who will help the conveyancer to get these certificates illegally. I'm not saying it can't happen, but what I'm saying is if you are using a reputable agent, if you're using a reputable conveyancing firm, if you know that the parties that you are using in this transaction are doing the things, ticking the boxes above board, they are doing the tax clearance certificates properly, the chances of getting a transaction that's going to slip through the cracks illegally is slim to none. But if people want to be fraudulent, if people want to hide money or steal money, they will find a way to do that. But what you don't want to do is you want to make sure when you buy a property or when you sell a property that you don't fall prey to one of these criminals. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that every portion of the transaction is handled by a law firm that knows exactly how they should do it, what they should do, and that they are reporting the funds as they receive it properly, and that it will go through a proper FICA process. And that's the best way of securing a transaction like that.
Well, thank you very much for your time to all three of our guests. That was Managing Director for law firm SSLR Incorporated, Cilna Steyn, Anthony Ketcher. He's the Regional Manager for Seeff Property Group, and Erwin Roeder. He's a property researcher, actually, not an economist. Apologies for that, Mr. Roeder. And he's also CEO of Roeder and Associates. Thank you very much to you all for your time.